from Umamsbongile Khumalo, Pretiende to Phumeza Matshikiza, amongst others. Those names have something in common, and that's their undeniable contribution to the space of opera in South Africa. Dr. Wayne Muller is a research fellow at the African Open Institute for Music at Stellenbosch University, and he's penned a book tracing just how far or where opera started in South Africa, and he's spoken of opera having been Africanized and introduced to the continent through colonialism. He joins us now to help us understand his work, rather. Dr. Muller, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Maybe first, just out of curiosity, what got you into this space to take a look at these reviews to ultimately produce this book?
Good afternoon, Deirdre, and the viewers. Yes, so I've been an arts journalist. I'm a freelance arts journalist at the moment, but I was a full-time arts journalist at the Burger in Cape Town, so I wrote a lot about classical music because that is my field. I grew up playing piano and organ, and at university also did singing. So I'm obviously interested in the space of classical music and opera. And when I started being a journalist, I started writing about performances. I reviewed concerts and operas. And I was always interested in, but what is the value of writing these pieces of critique about what we perform on stage, and how do we explain what to our readers in the newspapers, for instance, or if you work in radio, how do you explain this to them, the changes that happens on stage? And I decided I want to research this. So I want to see what is the value of this. And in my research, I then started doing a PhD in musicology and looking at the reviews specifically and how they explain opera and chart a history of opera by writing these reviews. So my interest comes from being a journalist and being an art critic, and also in the topic of classical music. So I'm bringing those two disciplines together.
Okay, sure. What did you find out about how opera was established in South Africa?
So most of my work and the book also focuses on that. It's about opera in post-apartheid South Africa. But there is a bit on, so I did a timeline, I did some research on what has been written about opera, where are the sources of opera. So most of opera comes from the 19th century, or the sources that we have. So we have sources that say in 1803 there were opera companies from Europe coming here. They were traveling opera companies, and they came obviously by ship to Cape Town, and they performed in makeshift theatres. So that was the way, and it was mostly opera comique. So it wasn't your serious operas that we know, Verdi and Puccini. It was more the comical operas. So those were the things that were performed in the 19th century. And as people started to settle here, people coming from Europe and other in the global north, coming to South Africa and settling here, they started, industry started developing. So we have a lot of operas. We started building theatres. There was a bit of professionalization. So we have people who started, opera companies starting to form, and they're paying salaries to the singers. So all of that happened during the 19th century. It's 100 years of development in opera. And then obviously we get to the 20th century, where we have the opera school at the University of Cape Town that was started in 1954. So we had started having music training here in South Africa. And then we have the apartheid era, where opera was also used to advance the agenda of the apartheid government, used in that way as a political, employed politically to do that. So yes, and then we get to post-apartheid South Africa, where we do interesting things with opera and start making opera our own. So it's like you mentioned earlier about the Africanization of opera, or what we also call the indigenization of opera, making it our own genre.
Okay, I'd like for us to expand on that, because I think that's what caught my attention in terms of the Africanization of opera. What does that mean?
So yes, we call it the Africanization, but I mean it's actually what we mean by the word is making it sort of relevant to a South African audience, and particularly a South African audience, because there are forms of opera in the rest of the continent that also mean you have Yoruba opera in Nigeria. In Somalia, we also have other forms of musical theatre that happens that is called opera. So what we have obviously have our reference of Western European opera. So what we did with opera is we started changing how it is performed. So the way in which it was performed, the music, we started fiddling with the music, and we started expanding and writing our own operas with our own stories. So there's a few things that happened, and I call it strategies of indigenization and Africanization that happened in opera in South Africa. So we have all these strands of making it our own genre, doing things that is difficult to our context, and making people feel that this is relevant to our society.
Doc, I'm not even sure how to present this question, so I'm just going to maybe take you through the thought process, because a colleague of mine, Vusizwe Langa, was talking about what could be when you hear it from our uneducated ears, right? So if you listen at ukukikiza, ukulilizela, ukuyoqoma, when young maidens, there's a process called ukuyoqoma, and the young maidens sing along the way, or ukumisa indugu, that's what the process is called, and the singing that is done there, it could very well be argued that that art form has been in existence even before, what is it, discovered, or what's the word that is like to be used? There's a word, discovered, but basically, even before colonialism, this art form, it is argued, has always been in South Africa, maybe in particular if we take a look at this situation. And so how reliable has this history that you were relying on, the written history, been, given that we've also got oral history?
Mm-hmm. So yes. So there's, obviously in this country we have issues with the writing of history, and history is also, the saying that history is written by the conquerors. So people sort of, what is the word? They put themselves in the position of being the conquerors, and that's how we write history. So there's a lot of stories that through that process of history writing becomes buried away and unacknowledged. So yes, there are many forms of musical theatre, I mean, in the rest of Africa and the continent also, that has not been acknowledged as theatre. We come from a place where we think that Western European, and I write this also in the book, that Western European opera is at the pinnacle of musical expression. But there are so many other forms, and I think that is what we could do in South Africa, is to incorporate all those forms and traditional songs and things that were here before opera even came before, 500, 600, 700 years ago, that we could those traditions employ in opera. And an example is Princess Magogo, the opera by Mzilikazi Kumalo, who took Zulu songs, traditional songs, and Princess Magogo songs, incorporating that into the genre of what we understand as Western European opera, but also other traditional theatrical performances or musical theatres, what I just said about Nigeria and the Yoruba opera, other forms of musical theatre and singing, and combine that. And I think that is what we had. But coming back to your question about the history, the writing of history. So what I did, I just went to see what are the sources. And the only thing that we have today is to interrogate those sources and say, is this really how it happened? I'm trying to find out other ways of telling the story or looking at the story. And if we can get some of the original sources, we looked with different eyes, with 21st century eyes at them, and the different contexts that we come from. We look at those sources and explain what it means. One of the examples that I can use is another book that I worked on, that we were a collective called the Owen History Project. So the Owen group was an opera company, an amateur, well, they were called an amateur opera company in Cape Town, consisting of people from District 6, mostly the colored community from District 6, and they did opera. They performed La Traviata. They had a long tradition of about 30 years of opera performance in Cape Town. But that history was never written down. There was you don't have, if you go to the formal history books of performance in South Africa, they're not mentioned there. So what we did as a collective, we did interviews. So then oral history comes into it. So we did interviews with them and penned those interviews and what people could remember. And luckily we could do about 47 interviews for that project. There were still people around that performed and know the history of the group. so that it could be penned. So those are the things that we try to do rectify the history and the imbalances and the stories that weren't told and were unacknowledged for centuries, to bring that back into our music history.
Doc, do you have the book next to you by any chance?
I do.
Can you flash it for us?
Okay.
And there you go. That is Dr. Muller's book titled Opera in Cape Town, The Critic's Voice. But Doc, before we let you go, how do you perceive that the telling of history will change? More so maybe when you take a look at the space we find ourselves in today, right? So you can go online, people can record, or rather, how important is it that history be told digitally, whatever, so it's not just a reliance on one space or one sector, if you will?
Yes, it is a very important thing. I think, especially because I do research in music, I think it's a field where people not necessarily archive things. When we talk about politics, we have a parliament that documents things. That does not happen in the music industry as much, and we need to find ways of putting that into record. So what we do at the Africa Open Institute is also a lot on archiving and different types of archiving. So, for instance, I have a news clip archive of all the operas performed in Cape Town that were covered since 1990, no, actually since the 70s. So all those things we have to put together so that there are sources that people can work from to tell the stories of music performance. Even the recordings, we have some videos of opera performances that no one has seen and that nobody writes about and engages with the content. What does it mean in our society today? So and that also changes over time. How we see opera between 1990 and 1994 is totally different to how we see opera today or 10 years ago. So we need to constantly document all those changes for people to start writing history. And I think that was the problem as I started my study, was that there were no archives. I had to go to the Artscape Center and get pamphlets marketing pamphlets to just establish a timeline of when and what was performed. So I think it's an important thing to archive these things and telling the story. I mean, we have a rich music culture in our country, and we have a rich country with many cultural groups, and all of them have their own music histories, and we need to tell those stories.
Sure. Which performer were you introduced to through your research that you didn't know about? And tell us about their story and why you found them fascinating.
That's a difficult question. Some of it, most of it I've learned of before I started the study. But I think what interested me mostly was all the performers that got into opera right at the beginning, when opera was still in the apartheid era, a white thing. It was a white establishment. And we started getting people in, so the people like Virginia Davids and Sidwell Hartman at the beginning, and their stories interest me. And then eventually we have this legacy of Pretty Yende that is a student of Virginia Davids. And also those stories interest me, how we let the legacy and opera go forward, and we've got generations of people that were outside of the norm, if you want to call it that, of what opera is supposed to be, and taking that to the stage today, and as South African opera and being from South Africa.
Okay, Dr. Muller, thank you very much for your contribution this afternoon. Dr. Muller's book is titled Opera in Cape Town, The Critic's Voice. You can find it at any good bookstore.